Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Kaplan. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's talk. I'll have my colleague, Dr. Naomi Lindstrom, introduce our speaker in just a moment. But before she begins, I wanted to highlight a couple of events that we have upcoming in the next week. On Wednesday of this week, there is a book talk with Professor Walter Russell Mead, who will be speaking on the Ark of a Covenant, the United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People, on Wednesday in the Bass Lecture Hall from 12:15 to 1:30 p.m. And then our signature event for the semester, the Gale Family Foundation Fall Lecture, will be held on Sunday, November 13th, this coming Sunday at 5 p.m. at the Texas Union Theater, also room 2.228. The title of the lecture is New Light on the Archaeology of Jerusalem in the 7th Century BCE, and the lecture will be presented by Dr. Oded Lipschitz of Tel Aviv University. Hope you're able to attend the event. Make sure to go to our website to register for free complimentary tickets. Hope you're able to make any or all of these events, and I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Naomi Lindstrom, who is the Gale Family Foundation Professor of Jewish Arts and Culture in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. So today's lecture, Gender, Race, and the Myth of the Jewish Gaucho, presented by Dr. Amy Kaminsky. We have a number of co-sponsors. The Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas, principal sponsor, and Program of Race, Indigeneity, and Migration, Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Program in Comparative Literature, COLA Office, Liberal Arts, of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion are our co-sponsors. And now, Amy Kaminsky, our star today. She's Professor Emeritus of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, Global Studies, and Jewish Studies at the University of Minnesota. In theory, she is retired and emeritus, but discovered that the lure of academic life was too strong and has continued to be active. She is considered a pioneer in the field of Latin American feminist literary criticism. I remember that your first works in this area were appearing in the 70s, very, very early feminist critic of Latin American literature. And she's done a number of things since then, but her most recent book is The Other/Argentina, Jews, Gender, and Sexuality in the Making of a Modern Nation, published by SUNY Press last year. And she's had some further thoughts since then, which we'll hear about, I understand. So we're delighted to have her here in Austin, and welcome to Gender, Race, and the Myth of the Jewish Gaucho.
Thank you, Naomi, for that really lovely introduction. I am old. It's great to be a pioneer. It's great to have taught in a field that didn't exist, help make it up, and see that it's real. I want to thank the Schusterman Center for inviting me, and to Karen Marco for doing everything that gets done in putting a visit together. And I want to thank you for being here. I'm going to put on glasses. Now you've seen me look professional, but it is too warm. I'm not used to Texas weather. So there we go. In Minnesota, where I live, and especially at the university from which I'm now retired, it's become customary to acknowledge the land on which we live and work as the ancestral homeland of the indigenous people who stewarded it for centuries before European foreigners showed up and claimed it for their own. There's a similar story contained in my discussion of the Jewish Gauchos and the Argentine Pampas, and eventually I'll get to it more or less. But the gesture is really what I want to highlight now. Like the white settlers in Minnesota who have taken so much from the first people who lived and continue to live in my adopted home state, I'm deeply indebted to the work of scholars who have made my field of study so rich. I am also deeply and awkwardly aware that such acknowledgments, like those made to Native people, are much less than I owe them. Edna Eisenberg, Naomi Lindstrom, Monika Schurmuck, Daniel and Jonathan Boyarin, Sandra McGee-Deutsch, Darrell Lockhart, Judith Friedenberg, and Josefina Ludmer are just a few, and I mean just a few, of those whose work I have learned so much from and whose ideas inspire and thread through this talk. In calling the Jewish Gaucho a myth, I mean to suggest that he is constituted by a story. Typically, myths are created to explain or justify some culturally salient, often natural phenomenon, and they emerge out of the nebulae of oral tradition. But the origin of the Jewish Gaucho myth can be precisely located in a single literary text, namely Alberto Gerchunov's Los Gauchos Judíos, the Jewish Gauchos, first published in 1910. Its dissemination can be discerned in the many editions of the text that followed its first appearance, including 2 translations into English and 1 into French, and its adaptation as a feature film, as well as subsequent narratives, commentaries, scholarly books and articles, and at least 1 documentary film. Gerchunov writes the Jewish Gaucho into being not to explain an already existing phenomenon, but rather to establish and define something new, quite deliberately publishing it to coincide with the 100th anniversary of Argentina's independence. It was later that his invention of the Jewish Gaucho metamorphosed into something larger, making a claim on the already mythic qualities of the Gaucho himself. This photograph, for example, was used to illustrate a recent article on the Jewish Gauchos for a Massachusetts audience. But the man in the picture is not identified, and there's no indication that he was Jewish. And as far as I've been able to discern, the photo is not part of the extensive collection of images of immigrant Jews held by the Mark Turco Center in Buenos Aires, the source of most of the historical slides I'll be showing you here. Myth, of course, bears an accusatory edge of untruth, and certainly the figure of the Jewish Gaucho is not entirely real. The agricultural settlements established for Jewish immigration fleeing persecution in Tsarist Russia were in fact part of a national project to turn the open countryside of Argentina, formerly populated by indigenous people and the largely mestizo gauchos who once lived on the unfenced land, into a productive sector of a modernizing economy. The Jewish Colonization Association that interacted with the Argentinian government on the one hand and with Jewish immigrants on the other would appear to be the very embodiment of Argentina's so-called civilizing project, parceling out land to settlers and encouraging agricultural production. The JCA settlements were part of an economy buttressed by a bureaucracy that curtailed cattle and horses ranging freely over the land and eventually ended the gauchos' access to them. Jewish settlers joined a system already in place that had resulted in the impoverishment of the gaucho and the criminalization of his way of life. By attaching themselves to both the gaucho and to the land, Gerchunov's fictional settlers, but also the real immigrants on whom he based his characters, stake a claim to legitimacy as Argentines. But why is the Jewish Gaucho a figure specific to a minority group in an apparently peripheral nation, such a compelling figure for so many people? In my earlier work, I showed that Argentina itself occupies an outsized place in the Western imaginary, including the Jewish imaginary, precisely because it is both appealingly other in relation to most cosmopolitan centers, and because its immigrant history has bound it to so much of the rest of the world. More recently, I'm showing you this because I love the covers, the one thing that I had nothing to do with except to say, oh, I love the covers. More recently, I argued that the Jews in Argentina have staked a claim to national belonging by asserting their Argentineity. Taken together, these propositions go some distance in explaining the interest in the Jewish Gaucho in Argentina and beyond, especially among Jews. The Jewish Gaucho, as a rhetorical device, argues the case that being Jewish is another way of being Argentine. Gerchunov's title, Los Gauchos Judíos, boldly asserts that immigrant Jews had become so deeply Argentinian as to be gauchos. Despite Gerchunov's confident title, These are real guys with real names. The Jewish gaucho was not a fait accompli. It was, rather, a figure of desire, the longing for acceptance into the body of the nation in one's full integrity, to be a Jew and an Argentinian both. The construct Jewish gaucho must struggle to achieve this equilibrium, sometimes in the face of the blatant anti-Semitism it was designed to undercut. But we cannot talk about Jewish gauchos without addressing gauchos and Jews unmodified. And there can be no discussing either without examining the undercurrents of gender, race, and ethnicity coursing through those terms of identity. The figure of the gaucho, grounded in reality but sanitized and romanticized, is fundamental to the construct Argentina. In her subtle, exhaustive study of the gaucho genre, Josefina Ludmer describes the internal tension embodied by the gaucho. This is the cover of her book, both in English and in Spanish. He represents both civilization and barbarism, that tragic contradiction in Argentina's national consciousness, over which opposing political parties have battled since the nation's inception. The figure of the gaucho is a product of both historical processes and cultural elaboration, reality bedecked in and sometimes smothered by story. The historical gaucho was subjected to vagrancy laws that both conscripted him as a soldier and forced him to labor for elite landholders. The reality is that reality is repressed in favor of the story of the free-roaming, manly, courageous, generous individualist, loosely attached to family and loyal to his patron. The gaucho then brims over with meaning, alternately representing criminality, racial uncertainty, and violence on the one hand, and loyalty, courage, generosity, and patriotism on the other. This duality expresses just how the gaucho is both central to Argentinian identity and one of Argentina's others. In fact, that's part of his charm. Moreover, as both self and other in Argentina, the gaucho mirrors the Jew, who historically has been the other within of European Christian culture. Excuse me. The lone gaucho, sovereign of the Pampas, adept with both the guitar and the long-bladed knife called a facon, was already part of the mythic past when Jews arrived in numbers to settle in the agricultural colonies. Nevertheless, the successful myth must be tethered to the world in which it circulates in order to be of use. Gauchos, however diminished, did still live on the Pampas when Jews struggled to be farmers and ranchers there. And Jews did take on some of their practices, embracing both the myth and the lifestyle, making them their own. This photograph, the one that you saw before, of a Jewish immigrant in gaucho dress was actually made before its subject even got to the countryside. It is a studio portrait taken in 1909, just as Gershunov was composing the Jewish gauchos, and shortly after his subject, the dashing Mr. Sandler, I fell in love with this guy, arrived in Argentina. Sandler was headed for the JCA colony called Moises Villa, named for both the founder of the colony and Moses. But when this photograph was made, he was still living in the transitional space of the Immigrants Hotel in Buenos Aires. Gershunov himself strategically lays claim to a gaucho identity for Jews at a time when it is already a term of nostalgia, soon to reach the peak of its romantic nationalistic potency. This nostalgia is also a feature of the memorialization of the Jewish gaucho, evident in this event commemorating the 75th anniversary of Moises Villa, and also Guillermo Meresman's sweet and scholarly 1997 documentary film about Leon Borodovsky called The Last Jewish Gaucho. This is a still from the film showing Borodovsky wearing the neckerchief and hat typical of the gauchos and carrying the Torah. The embrace of Argentine rural life by a significant number of Jewish immigrants was very real, and its loss now captures the imagination. The gaucho as criollo, the quintessence, or if I were being properly Argentinian criollo, the quintessential native-born Argentinian, was a model for the immigrants of the JCA colonies. The criollo's meaning, however, had already undergone a certain metamorphosis by the time Jews reached Argentina in large numbers. The term criollo originally referred to the descendants of Spaniards born in the colonies, a term of whiteness mitigated by geography. It was good to be white. It was better to be European white. It was a little less good to be criollo white. It eventually came to mean native-born and largely rural. But this version of the native, whose ancestors are European, repressed the very indigeneity it worked so hard to exterminate, both literally and rhetorically, especially in Argentina. And the gaucho is necessarily mestizo, mixed race. His origins lie in the conquest of indigenous land and women by European men. The border between gaucho and Indian is nothing if not fluid. In the foundational text of the gaucho genre, José Hernández's neo-epic poem Martín Fierro, the protagonist and his comrade Cruz desert the army, passing from the territory of obedience, duty, whiteness, and the colonizing project into the space of the indigenous other to escape the rigors of the military. But of course, that military has been penetrating and claiming Indian lands. How safe can they be there? This paradox is emblematic of the gaucho himself, the native Argentinian par excellence, who carries within him indigeneity and as such, is, in a sense, the agent of his own destruction. Fierro's companion Cruz, in fact, does not make it out of Indian country alive. Probably the best known scene in Martín Fierro recounts the protagonist's deadly fight at a dance, in which he taunts a black couple and eventually kills the man in a knife fight. Much later, Fierro engages in an improvisational song competition with a black counterpart. As prominent as Fierro's racism is in the knife fight episode, in the song battle scene, it resolves into a respectful interchange that includes an exploration of racial difference. As these episodes suggest, not a few gauchos were black. Black men, some formerly enslaved on estancias, large ranches, where they learned a vast array of ranching skills, also fought in the colonialist wars waged on the Pampas, a service for which they were offered their freedom from slavery. Many of those men stayed on as gauchos after the wars ended. Nevertheless, black gauchos seem hidden in plain sight. Despite their presence in the Martín Fierro and in reality, the mythic gaucho of the Argentine Pampas remains stubbornly mestizo. The several captions, and this picture shows up in several different places, on this late 19th century photograph depicting two gauchos, one of whom is clearly black, makes no reference to racial difference at all in any of the captions. And you'll notice that it's labeled as from 1880 and 1866, and it's just a lot of this stuff is made up. But this photograph is in fairly wide circulation, but never mentions the fact that this guy's black. Josefina Ludmer argues that as Argentina's subaltern, the gaucho did not speak, but rather was enunciated by writers creating a hegemonic discourse for the nation. Nevertheless, the historical gaucho was not completely silent. He was often a payador, a singer of his own time and his own story. Apart from functioning much like medieval troubadours wandering the countryside, recounting events from one town to another, payadores engaged in improvisational contests that look very much like contemporary battle rap or the dozens. Accompanying themselves on the guitar, each singer would engage with his opponent's story, contradicting and reinforcing it, adding detail and complexity with each turn. Hernández's poem is presented as the improvisation of Fierro himself as payador. And black payadores were an important part of this story. Gabino Ezeiza, arguably Argentina's most celebrated payador, was of African descent. a man who defeated his Uruguayan counterpart in a famous battle in song. The payador skill is understood in the military, even nationalistic terms of battles fought and victories won. And as you can see, Ezeiza here is in urban dress. He also sang in concert halls. But as the militarization of even his musical prowess suggests, the gaucho is a quintessentially masculine figure. There is no feminine counterpart to the term. In English, there's such a thing as a cowgirl, but in Spanish, gaucha doesn't quite compute. The gaucho may well have a woman in his life, but she is the convenient repository of racial as well as gender difference. She is domestic, maternal, sexually, and more explicitly racialized than her partner. She is referred to as a china, or often chinita, which, despite the sound of it, is not a mark of Asianness, but rather derives from a Quechua word meaning female. Although the diminutive chinita may mark affection within an intimate relationship, insofar as the word inscribes indigeneity, it is as well a marker of class and level of respectability. And not surprisingly, the term chinita is also used to refer to the indigenous or mestiza servant in white households. The gaucho's masculinity, untethered to domestic space, is reinforced in juxtaposition to her constrained domesticity. And in her maternal role, she is the primal source of the gaucho's mean of mestizaje. In contrast to the gaucho's racial fluidity, Jewish identity relies on the racial purity of Jewish women. They can never be chinitas. Indeed, one thing that divides Jewish gauchos from real gauchos is the role of women in their origin story. The gaucho makes a claim to autochthonous Argentineity via the silenced indigenous woman, conscripted into domestic and sexual servitude during the taking of Indian territory. He is the mixed-race child of conqueror and conquered. Conversely, the women in the Gaucho Judío stories are necessarily part of the Jewish immigrant community. The very point of Jewish gauchos is that they can be both Jewish and Argentinian, but to be Jews, they have to be the children of Jewish mothers. The anxiety over Jewish women's sexual purity can be seen in the power of one particular image that appeared as an illustration in Gerchunov's book. It depicts the Jewish daughter, this is one episode that he recounts, swept away on horseback by a real, that is, Gentile gaucho. No fewer than 3 editions of the texts use this image in part or in full on their covers. It is a compelling image precisely because not only does it imply the uncontrollable nature of the woman's sexuality, astride the horse, behind her lover, her hair caught by the wind, it undercuts the very notion of the Jewish gaucho, who in this episode anyway cannot compete with his authentic Gentile model. Also, it's one of the few episodes in Los Gauchos Judíos that the women in Gerchunov's texts are, for the most part, the objects of desire and helpmeets of male protagonists. Rewriting the Jewish gaucho story that center women characters often focus on the drudgery, the danger, the isolation, and the hardship for women who participated in this colonizing project, and sometimes their need to escape it altogether. Moreover, the women's contributions are often aligned with traditional Jewish domesticity, especially on keeping a kosher home, on promoting modernity in the form of education, libraries, and other cultural interventions. And that's suggested by this photograph of the newly installed teachers in the Carlos Cáceres settlement. I couldn't find the date for this, but from the clothing, it looks like the 30s, would you say? Not sure. I'm not a fashion historian. Gerchunov's narrative may struggle to align Jewishness with Gaucho-centered Argentineity, but the one place that they easily coincide is in their marginalization of women and the centering of masculine subjectivity. The idea of the Jewish gaucho implicitly asserts that gaucho and Jew are intrinsically masculine terms, but both are haunted by femininity. The figure of the gaucho is internally riven around issues of citizenship and productivity, which themselves are rooted in class-specific ways of being a man. And in a system of binaries in which the subaltern maps onto the feminine, there is room for the gaucho to align with femininity, especially via his link to the Indian mother, which is an argument that several scholars have made. For its part, the anti-Semitic trope of the feminized Jewish male is all too familiar. So it's not surprising that Gerchunoff sidesteps the feminization of the gaucho in establishing the Jewish gaucho's rock-like heteronormative masculinity. In Gerchunoff's text, Jewish masculinity retains study of Talmud and piety, but also accrues the frontier masculinity that values the productivity of agricultural labor and nation building that undermine the negative stereotype of the physically weak, femininely cunning, and economically retrogressive Jew. The myth of the Jewish gaucho is and always has been anything but static. Rooted in desire, it oscillates between veracity and invention. Moreover, in proposing the conjunction of two dissimilar elements, Jew and gaucho, it verges on the oxymoronic. And finally, because both Jew and gaucho are internally riven, it must contend with the internal incoherence of these two incommensurate terms. In their otherness, Jews, gauchos, indigenous people, and blacks, aligned with the body, irrationality, and danger, are feminized within the dominant discourse. The multiple instabilities contained by the Jewish gaucho both upset the construct and, in the dynamism they produce, keep the dyad alive. When the Jew and the gaucho come together in the gaucho judío, the result is not just a layering of traits, but rather the production of another kind of subject filled with its own internal contradictions. Gregorio Tavosnanska's 1999 novel, Yidel el Judío Pampa, I am in the right place, good, questions the construct of the Jewish gaucho altogether, disengaging the Jew from the gaucho and realigning him with the indigenous subject. Yidel takes on the trappings of the Jewish gaucho, but his guide and mentor is a Pampa Indian. The title of the novel switches the places of the nation, of the noun and the adjective that Gerchunoff proposed. Yidel is not the Jewish Indian, he is rather the Indian Jew. And the novel posits the gaucho soldier as the counterpart of the Cossack, identifying Jews with Indians and against the gaucho. Tavosnanska also picks up the theme of racial unease in Yidel when the title character observes the taunting of a black man in a rural bar, echoing the knife fight scene in the Fierro. In Yidel, the black man turns out to be a sophisticated urbanite. The Jewish protagonist is both sympathetic to him, intervening in a violent attack on the man, and disdainful of him in a display of his own racist behavior. Tavosnanska is one of many revisionists who trouble and question the myth of the Jewish gaucho by engaging with it. Women writers who center the women settlers in their stories, political progressives who reject the retrogressive politics that the gauchos helped carry out. These revisions, like the Jewish gaucho myth itself, circulate primarily among Jews. Nor is the gaucho story itself marked by any Jewish presence. In the end, and despite the aspirational noun-adjective construct, the Jewish gaucho is a kind of Jew, one who made a life in rural Argentina, not a kind of gaucho. What is more, the particular form of Jewish life originating in the JCA colonies is always being left behind as subsequent generations move to cities, entering the middle class, just like Gerchunoff himself, planting wheat and reaping doctors. My goal of disentangling the both-and nature of Jewish alterity in Argentina with a consideration of the trope of the Jewish gaucho, especially as it engages with the spectral presence of both blacks and Indians, landed me in a vast historical literary scholarship. The unraveling I had wanted to accomplish was, in fact, not only hopeless, but also, I think, ill-advised. It's the very entanglement that accounts for the richness and appeal of the story of Jewish Argentine alterity read through the trope of the Jewish gaucho. What seemed to me a tangle at the beginning turns out to be a lush fabric of meaning that continues to be productive and maddeningly appealing. its palette of discord and contradiction intrinsic to its lure. I'll leave you here with this image, created by children, suggestive of this appeal. It's a photograph of a mural in Moises Villa, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the founding of the community, whose first section intertwines symbols of Argentina and Jewishness. And I'm happy to talk about this slide and others and anything else that you'd like to. Thank you very much.